Definitely not doing that. Okay, well, they didn't miss much. Verse 9. Let it serve as a sign for you on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the Lord's instruction may be in your mouth. For the Lord brought you up out of Egypt with a strong hand. Keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your ancestors, and he gives it to you. You are to present to the Lord every firstborn male of the womb. All firstborn offspring of the livestock you own that are males will be the Lord's. You must redeem every firstborn of a donkey with a flock animal, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. However, you must redeem every firstborn among your sons. In the future, when your son asks you, what does this mean? Say to him, by the strength of his hand, the Lord brought us up out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both of the firstborn of humans and the firstborn of livestock. And that is why I sacrifice to the Lord all the firstborn of the womb that are males, but I redeem all the firstborn of my sons. So let it be a sign of your hand and a symbol on your forehead. For the Lord brought us up out of Egypt by the strength of his hand. So, isolating specifically a portion of verse 15, that's why I sacrifice to the Lord all the firstborn of the womb that are males, but I redeem all the firstborn of my sons. So I think when we think systematically through the liturgical year of what the Hebrews would celebrate, and the first of their feasts comes on the 14th day of the first month. There's nothing before that. On the 10th day, they're isolating that choice lamb or goat that's going to become the paschal sacrifice, and they slaughter it on the evening of the 14th day. Then there's a week-long celebration of this Feast of Unleavened Bread that we just read about here. But any time that a male is born, either from a woman, and we'll talk about that here in a second, what that looks like, or in this particular case, why it's a bit more important for us to discuss this up front. When it comes to firstborn males that are born of beasts, they have to have some manner of redemption in tow. And as we speak through this, I hope it begins to open our minds to a greater understanding of how often blood is being spilt, and better than that, a memorial. That's the first column that I have up here. That sacrificing the firstborn of clean animals would be an additional reminder of the event of Passover. So think about that. In fact, here in verse 15, the question is hypothetically put forth by Moses to these fathers, and instruction given as to why you need to make sure your sons understand this. So with that, the implication would be, even if your son doesn't ask, you as a father have the innate responsibility from this point on to explain to your sons that this is costly, and at the same time, it's not wasteful. Because naturally a child, as inquisitive and curious as they are, would start to think through these things and wonder, why in the world, if we have just brought forth an ox from a female cow, and that is not only a precious animal, but at the same time a very costly and valuable animal, are we actually going to allow it to stay with its mother for a handful of days, and then we're going to take it to the priest at the altar of burnt offering, and we're going to slit this animal's throat, collect its blood, and we're going to burn a portion of it on the altar? Why not just let it grow up and contribute to the community? Because we have no idea whether or not the cows that are going to be born are going to be oxes, or maybe we actually need one. The one that we have is kind of old, and this is the first one that's kind of come along in a couple of generations, and we're going to have to give that one up because it's the first one that breaks open through the virginal womb of his mother. But rest assured, as we discuss this process a little more, it's not going to be wasteful. But nonetheless, when the father takes the sacrifice to the tabernacle, when he begins to explain to his son with the retort of, Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, but the Lord killed every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of humans and the firstborn of livestock. And he has claimed this as his own, because he also claimed us, the firstborn males, as his own. We deserve death as much as the Egyptian households did, and so did our livestock. He did not spare them. He spared us. He's claimed them. They are rightfully his. And we give them over to him as a memorial every generation to make sure that we understand what it is the Lord did to redeem us. So not only do they have, on the 14th day of the first month, this nationwide celebration that reminds them and gives them all the chance, generationally, to experience a celebration of the Passover as if they were that generation of Israelites leaving the land of Egypt. But now throughout the year, they get more reminders, considering all the various animals they may have. It's not just an ox. It might also be from your goats or your sheep, or whatever the case might be, if it's a suitable sacrifice, a clean animal, then its blood will have to be spilt. Now, it's also a provisional sustenance or means of sustenance for the priesthood, because the meat from these sacrifices would work to sustain them. Later on, Moses is going to give additional Torah when they are out actually moving away from Sinai. Numbers 18, we'll look at those verses. However, you must not redeem the firstborn of an ox, a sheep, or a goat. They are holy. You are to splatter their blood on the altar and burn their fat as a food offering for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But notice this, it's not a burnt offering. It does not get completely consumed on the altar. Only the fat, which is always considered to be the best portion of the animal, we'll explore more of that when we get into Leviticus, is given over to the Lord. But the rest of the meat is held back. And the Lord says that this meat belongs to you. Now, in this particular passage, he's speaking to the tribe of Levi, namely the Aaronites and the Levites. Any of them may partake of this meat as long as they are ritually clean, and by virtue of that, they have the chance to enter into the sacred space of the tabernacle, courtyard, or maybe the tent of meeting, depending upon their station, and they have to eat it in a clean place. Again, we'll discuss that when we're in Leviticus. But later on, as Moses is about to bow out of the picture, and he's going to turn the reins of leadership over to Joshua, and what becomes the month-long sermon series that turns into the book of Deuteronomy, in the 15th chapter, he goes a step further. And we understand that the meat from these sacrifices was also meant to be shared amongst the families. Let's look here. Consecrate to the Lord your God every firstborn male produced by your herd and your flock. You're not to put the firstborn of your oxen to work, so they never bear a yoke. You're not even to shear the firstborn of your flock, so they never even make it to the point where they actually have produced enough wool to take off. And if they have, for some reason, then that's wrong. But either way, each year you and your family are to eat it before the Lord your God in the place the Lord your God chooses. So let's try to put this together. Firstborn ox that comes from the virginal cow's womb. We can raise it a little while alongside its mother, but a yoke cannot be put on its neck. When the time is right, and we're not given exactly how long that's supposed to be, but when the time is right, then we wind up taking that to the priest. I, as the father, spiritual head of my family, am explaining to my children why exactly we're doing this. We are honoring the Lord because He chose to spare us and our livestock on that night of the first Paschal celebration in the land of Egypt, and He did not spare His wrath from the Egyptians. And He has claimed both the firstborn of man and beast to be His, and I redeem the firstborn of my sons. I redeem all my sons, but I do not redeem those animals that the Lord has claimed because they are given in celebration to Him. And we as a community, now with priest who gets the portion that's dedicated to him, whether it's thigh or shoulder, depending upon the animal, and of course the sacrifice, and the rest of the meat, we all get to sit down and basically have a picnic with the Lord, and we get to share this food meal with Him in celebration and remembrance over what He's done. But Dad, didn't we already kind of do this with the Passover? Yes, we did, my boy, but that's okay because we need to remember and remember often what it is the Lord did to save us. Now, there are even provisions for what you wind up doing if the animal comes out with a defect. It's got a maimed limb or something like that. What happens with an animal that's clean, so potentially suitable for sacrifice, but it has a defect? Can that animal be offered on the altar of the Lord? No. So, in this case, would it be suitable for sacrifice? No, but it's the Lord's. So what will the Lord do with it? Does He just simply give it back? No. We go to the Deuteronomy passage and we actually find out that those animals too are to be slaughtered, just not on the altar. You can slay those at the city gates, and with that, even a person who is ceremonially or ritually unclean, they then can be invited to the city gates and they can dine in this meal with you, so that none of it, even the best portions of it, because now you get to keep the fat, or maybe you can throw that on a rock or something like that and just say, we offer that unto the Lord, set that ablaze. But even the best portions, the shoulder and whatnot that would be given to the priests, they cannot eat that. Now you all and those who are not able to normally partake of this get the chance to eat this. So what is the broader understanding here, wisdom-wise, of this? God wants celebration. And God wants not only a good time to be had amongst His people, a memorial to be made of what it is that they endured all those generations ago in the goodness and mercy of their God, and to enjoy that with food and drink. Any questions on that? All right, So let's break the other half of that down then with respect to the idea of the firstborn amongst humans. It's the same concept, though, really. Firstborn human males are substituted by the Levites initially, and then they come to be redeemed by silver. So the way that this initially looked is it seems that, and we won't read this in the passages that we'll be covering, but this is actually part of the material of this section of the Bible that we would be reading, right up to Exodus 19. Because in Exodus 19, as you finish that chapter off, God is dialoguing with Moses, and he is kind of making sure, if we're, I think, appreciating the dialogue that we would if it was a conversation between humans, that the proper preparations have been put in place so that people will not go past these barriers. Because in their excitement, they may wind up going past the barriers at the base of Mount Sinai, and the Lord has already warned, if that happens, His holiness may break out against them. They will die, whether man or beast. But then he makes mention of priests. If the priests break forth and come past these barriers, then they will suffer the same fate. Here's the thing, though. At this point, there has been no speech on God's part whatsoever that we have record of, assuming this is chronological in sequence, or most of it anyway, about isolating a particular tribe of people as priests. So it's possible that he may be referencing all of the people, but he seems to be creating something of a dichotomy between the people and another group known as the priests. It would kind of be a little silly to assume these are the Levitical priests if there's been no mention of this. That would kind of bring a measure of disorder to the arrangement of the text that's not really invited into it unless we are trying to read it that way. However, we do have speech later on that God gives to Moses about what the original intent was with the firstborn of every family that was saved from Egypt that night. Let's say if I was the firstborn male of my house and I'm the one that has been substituted in the place of my family, that if the blood is not applied to the doorframe as it's supposed to be with a suitable sacrifice, then my family won't die. I'm the one the destroyer is going to take. But we did the right thing. We listened to Moses. We trusted in faith. We all stayed in the house that night. Blood was there. Death angel passed over. I have been rescued, and by virtue of that, my whole family. Now I have been consecrated to the Lord. I belong to Him. Initially, it seems that the Lord wanted to take me and everybody that fell into the same category as me and isolate us away from all the rest of the tribes and make us priests. Now, popular scholarly theology, and I don't have any reason to decry or to try to debunk this, suggests that the reason why God seems to have went a different direction with this is what happens in the events of chapter 32 of this book with the golden calf rebellion and whatnot. And because the tribe of Levi seemed to be more faithful than everyone else, that God chose to honor them by substituting them in the place of all the firstborn like me and put us on the shelf per se, and then give them the chance to stand in the gap and become the priests to the nation of priests. All right? And when that happens, then we get the mention of what we just talked about here, that the firstborn human males get substituted out by the Levitical sons. And of course, when a census is taken in Numbers chapter 3, the problem is there's a discrepancy. There are more firstborn males, I think by 273, than there are Levitical sons. And so by virtue of that, God gives instruction to Moses for the remainder, the fact that there are more firstborn sons than there are Levitical sons, you are to value that by 5 shekels per son, and you give that over to be stored up in the tabernacle, which leads us over then to the second category of sustenance, that the coinage collected here would be used eventually for the maintenance of either the tabernacle or the temple when that eventually supplants the tabernacle structure. We read here from Numbers 18, the same passage we just referenced a second ago with respect to animals. You must certainly redeem a firstborn human and redeem the firstborn of an unclean animal. You will pay the redemption price for a month-old male according to your assessment, 5 shekels of silver by the standard sanctuary shekel, which is 20 gerahs. So if we understand this correctly, we've already solved the puzzle for what happens with clean animals. They get sacrificed. If it's defective, then it still gets sacrificed, just not on the altar of the Lord. Big meal happens. Everybody gets the chance to share. God does not want human babies to be sacrificed, so they have to be redeemed by money. Same thing with an unclean animal. Both are put in the same category. The only exception to any of this is a donkey. You either have to redeem it by killing it, or you break its neck. That's just the way it goes. Killing it in the sense that, you have to redeem it with an animal of the flock. Either you substitute another animal, such as a goat or a sheep in its place, or you have to break its neck. Why that is with the donkey, we could speculate all day long. But that covers the whole gamut of this weird thing going on. And I think if we're being honest, we would all agree this is a little weird. Why is it that you have to redeem animals and kill one in the place of another, or you have to kill an animal when there's really no reason to be sacrificing in the case of atonement or anything like that? We have that whole section in Leviticus, the first 7 chapters, that talks about specific offerings that deal with unintentional sin and atonement and all this stuff leading up to the Day of Atonement. But this is a total separate category, and blood is still being spilt. And in the modern Western mind, the first thing that I think many of us probably will be flashing up in big neon lights is wasteful. Especially if any of us have ever done anything in the world of animal husbandry or farming or whatever, you realize how valuable these animals are and to shed their blood so willy-nilly. But hopefully, if we're paying attention to the details of the text, we realize there's a lot more at play here than just simply spilling blood and giving an animal over to God, because God later on says through the mouths of both psalmists and prophets alike, I don't need your sacrifices. I don't need the blood of these animals. That's not why. I'm not like these pagan gods who thrive off these things in order to maintain my existence and thereby your reality. And just as a side note, if you'll remember, we had this discussion when we were going through an earlier portion of Torah and talking about the Joseph story, and this little thing over here, I realize my cursor's not on the screen. I'm trying to get it there. There we go. This last block, this whole concept of Joseph and instructing his man to put the silver back in the sacks of his brothers, that we have them finding on 2 different occasions, and how this kind of referenced the idea or foreshadowed the concept of what we're talking about now, which we're getting an even deeper glimpse at. The idea that silver has a very strong connection with this idea of atonement with respect to ransom. In other words, a life that's in jeopardy and is meant to be taken away, snuffed out, undergo wrath. And that's exactly what the picture is with respect to firstborn humans. My son is supposed to be offered up. I'm supposed to give him to the priest, and the idea is that if the priest followed through with what was intended, the priest would kill him the same way he would the sheep that I offer up as the firstborn from the womb. But I have to, by command, redeem my son. And I only can do that not by putting an animal in its place, but by giving 5 shekels of silver. So I pay that price, and that becomes the blood money. Now, when you start thinking about that and start tying that into not only what happened with Joseph and him being betrayed, but then later on what will happen with the Messiah and how he is betrayed, this broader concept that is in play, and again for us, in some ways either offends our sensibilities or just leaves us with lots of question marks popping up above our head in the air. What's going on and why is that? And well, let's just get on past that because that doesn't make a lot of sense. Hopefully, this helps us better understand why these things are in place, because it's meant to speak to the concept of atonement. And also, this also keeps fellowship in balance, because the redeemed male child no longer belongs to the priests. That's the language that Moses gives in Numbers 15. The firstborn of, Numbers 18, verse 15. The firstborn of every living thing, human or animal, presented to the Lord belongs to you. In parentheses, you would be the priests. So if you think about it, I don't know what would happen in the case of a family who truly cannot afford to redeem their child. Would it be like a Samuel in the case of Eli, who was dedicated by his mother? That's not the reason behind that. I'm just saying, would it be like that? That I have to give my son to you and you keep him until either I can afford to redeem him or whatever. Later on, Jewish custom would further define this as to when the time frame would have to be for when the child can be redeemed. But they even made exception for the possibility that if a child is not redeemed by their parents, either because their parents are not practicing, they're apostates, whatever the case might be, once the child becomes an adult, so passes bar mitzvah, 13, now they are responsible for redeeming themselves. This is always looming over their heads. From the day they are born until they die, they have to be redeemed. All right, so any questions with respect to that? We've got a pretty good feel for what's kind of going on here. But remember, the larger context working in the background is Passover. They haven't even finished the Passover evening yet, and all of this presumably is being rolled out by Moses right there in the heart of Egypt, the land of Goshen, when he has just told them to isolate those animals that they are going to sacrifice that night so the death angel will pass over them. And he's telling them about what's going to come in generations in the future and how God is going to continue on this train of remembrance from now until time is no more with respect to what it is that he's done, not just with the annual celebration of Passover, but with every animal and child that is born and the firstborn to break through the womb. All right, Exodus 14. Let's read some verses from there. We're going to read the first 4 verses, then we'll jump down to verse 10. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and camp in front of Pi-hahiroth between Migdal and the sea. You must camp in front of Baal-zephon, facing it by the sea. Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, they are wandering around the land in confusion. The wilderness has boxed them in. I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. Then I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh and his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. Now to verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there they were the Egyptians coming after them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us up out of the land of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm. See the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet." All right. So we're going to read verses 15 through 25 as well. So skip on down there. And here they are at the brink of the Red Sea. The Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. As for you, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. As for me, I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army, and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who was going in front of the Israelite forces, moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. It came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. There was cloud and darkness, and it lit up the night, and neither group came near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove back the sea with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. The Egyptians set out in pursuit, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and went into the sea after them. During the morning watch, the Lord looked down at the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud. So notice it seems like they're combined together as a single entity, and threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. "Let's get away from Israel," the Egyptians said, "because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." So you'll notice the title of the slide, Parting the Sea, Going Back to Creation. Let's break this passage down. Verse 21, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to lead them on their way during the day, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light at night so that they could travel both day or night. Now we jump into chapter 14 with the idea of the pillar of cloud going from in front of the camp, as it's always leading from the front, now peeling off and going behind. Why? Because the Egyptians have closed them in. There's nowhere for them to go. The sea is in front. They have impassable rock cliffs to the north and south of them. To turn right around and to go the direction they came from will be waltzing right into the Egyptian forces who rolled up with their chariots, full armament. There's no doubt about the fact they want to slaughter everybody and turn this whole thing into a massive bloodbath. And so as they perhaps are igniting the charge, then this cloud separates off from the front and goes directly behind them and puts a barrier basically between both of these encampments, or the Egyptian forces and the Israelite camp. And as we look in verse 20, there was cloud and darkness. It lit up the night, and neither group came near the other all night long. So let's stop and think about this. Let's try to get a better appreciation, if you will, for the imagery that Moses is trying to put in play as he describes for us this eventful moment. So here we have the Israelites, and here's the Red Sea, and here's the beachhead that they're all gathered on. And here, of course, are the Egyptian forces that are coming in full force. And here, this pillar of cloud peels off and separates them into two totally separate camps. And it's a barrier that's effective enough that keeps the Egyptian forces from being able to press the advance through the night. Again, as I've said before, we have to get the image, as good as it might be, of Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston, out of our mind, and the idea that the sea peeled open immediately whenever he spoke or said or did anything to bring that to pass. God sends a wind, it blows all night long. Twilight hours of that night leading into the sunrise hours of the following morning, when they realize the sea has been parted, and of course the cloud moves, and the Egyptians see that and then give chase. But it seems like from the text that, as I pointed out, this pillar, while at no other point it's ever mentioned, it's singular cloud or singular fire by day or by night. At this particular moment, it seems to be both cloud and fire. It separates, and we are told that there is darkness and light. So is there another key moment in the biblical story up until this point that you can think of in which we have a clear distinction between both light, darkness, and a separation between the two? Creation story, precisely. Back in chapter 1, God said, "Let there be light." There was light. God saw that the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. Let's keep going. So the Lord drove the sea back with the powerful east wind all that night. We know that in Hebrew, the word wind is actually what? Come on, somebody say it. Starts with an R, ends with an H. Ruach, that's right. Got to clear that throat. Ruach. But this also means spirit. English translators try to do their best when they're giving us a good distinction between which one is at play. But in the Hebrew mind thought, what winds up happening with us is we try to force the separation. In their mind, there is no separation between the two. It's one and the same. Both are at play here because the spirit that comes into us to animate us at the moment of creation is indeed the wind or breath of God. That's another word I could add to that. But nonetheless, a powerful east wind blows all that night, turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. Can we think of another particular portion of the story prior to this point where God is using His Spirit, dividing waters, revealing dry land? When would that be? David and Goliath, that's right. Huh? Creation, that's exactly right. The Spirit of God, or the Ruach, was hovering over the surface of the waters. God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters, separating water from water." God remembered Noah. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water began to subside. See, I failed you, or you failed me, or maybe it's both. And we forgot the flood story, but this is the same language with respect to that. All right, moving on. The water came back, covered the chariots and the horsemen, plus the entire army of Pharaoh that had gone after them into the sea. Not even one of them had survived, but the Israelites had walked through the sea on dry ground. Now, obviously, if we're thinking through Genesis 1 and 2 at this point, there's nothing in either of those chapters that remotely comes close to this. There are no other human entities present, so who is God vanquishing with respect to this? But given that last blue box in the second column there, alluding to that story, is there any verbiage there that we might find that might come somewhat close to this idea? Chapter 7, verse 23. God wiped out every living thing that was on the face of the earth, from mankind to livestock, to creatures that crawl, to the birds of the sky that were wiped off the earth. Only Noah was left and those that were with him in the ark. And clearly, as we've already discussed in the Genesis narrative, there is so much more language embedded in this that helps us clearly tease out all the creation language that God is bringing over from Genesis 1 and 2 into the concourse of Genesis 8 and 9 to show us this is exactly what He's doing. He's recycling creation. He's giving it anew back to Noah, who is taking the place of the first priest king who died when Noah was born. And then lastly, each one threw down his staff. Now, this is not part of this particular account, but it's back to the moment when Moses and Aaron go brazenly before Pharaoh, and they throw down their staff, and it becomes a tanin, as we talked about, serpent, right? Or better yet, dragon. Each one threw down his staff, and it became a tanin. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their tanins. All right, so what does this have to do with any of that? Because as we were speaking through that, we were talking about this particular concept here and the idea that in all of this, we've got snake bashing language. It takes us right back to the first hopeful promise given and the moment when the first king and queen priest rebel, and now they have to be exiled from the sacred space that God had hedged them in But God is not completely cutting them off, for he will continue to speak to them outside that place, but they cannot come in here. They cannot partake of the tree of life. But that hopeful promise is the seed of the woman, in doing perpetual battle with the seed of the serpent, the Nakash, the shining one, will eventually deliver that death-wielding blow to his head. But as we talked through all of this, we looked at how much of that imagery in other parts of the Bible, including the Exodus story and that montage, is clearly speaking to the idea this is what God is doing. When he has warned Moses, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and he continues to reiterate that all through every phase of these plagues. And as we just read in this passage, I might have read past it too fast, but hopefully if you were following along, you picked up on that. Plagues are done with, but God once more and one final time says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. The full measure of it's finally coming to pass. This is that heel to the head of the viper. After this, the idea on the other side in Exodus 15, when he says you will see them no more, is that the snake is dead. Now, obviously, we know the larger meta-narrative concept of the Bible is that the snake is not dead, but the symbol of who represents the snake at this point is dead in the sense that him and his whole army have just experienced what they did with respect to this particular moment. So, notice what the psalmist says in Psalm 74. God, my king, is from ancient times, performing saving acts on the earth. You divided the sea with your strength. You smashed the heads of the sea monsters in the water. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. Now, this language here could be referencing what happened in creation, and I would say it does, but it very well could be alluding to what happens here in the context of Exodus 14, with him once again dividing waters. That's the point behind this. If we can see the clear, not just simple parallels, but points of connection, and we see that there are implications as we begin to apply those points of connection, and we see that creative language, let me back that up, creation language is brought to bear on this passage as much as it is the flood story of Noah from Genesis 6 through 9, then we must understand this is new creation in tow here. And with that, all of those themes working in Genesis 1 through 3 should be seen in some capacity here as well. Not because we're forcing them to be, but because we can clearly isolate them as such. And if we have other biblical writers centuries later referencing these events again and using those kind of montages, we have every right to use them just the same and to see them for what they are. Another place, Job says, God alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. Now, these sea creatures, these tanins, are given names. Leviathan is one. Rahab is another name given. Rahab's assistants cringe in fear beneath him. So get this. Job is saying that God is the wave walker. And as he is the one walking unyieldingly upon it because no one and no thing can challenge him, then this massive sea serpent underneath there, Leviathan, Rahab, call it what you want, quakes in fear beneath his step because she knows he can crush her heads. She cringes in fear beneath him. So how does that get brought to bear here? It's the idea of what these writers are saying with respect to who God is, what his power level is, and what they are to understand he did in not only creation, but this new act of creation with respect to delivering them. So, to pay that off a little bit more from what we discussed last week, does that make sense? Have I lost anybody with respect to that? It's important we grasp that because this theme is going to be brought to bear in many other places, especially Isaiah. Man, he really, really loves this talk. All right, celebrating victory, but going back to creation. Now, after the events of chapter 14, we get the first psalm of the Bible. We go to Exodus chapter 14 and we read the first 4 verses. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. He has thrown the horse and its rider into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. He threw Pharaoh's chariots and his army into the sea. The elite of his officers were drowned in the Red Sea. Now go with me to verses 14 through 18. When the peoples hear, they will shudder. Before I read any further, this is the whole point of this poem, this song sung in victorious celebration, is because of what they just encountered and where they are going. They have no idea the 40 years of wilderness wandering lies ahead of them, but where they're going. And they know who lives in and around the area of Canaan. They specifically call them out by name. Philistia, on the western side of the land of Canaan. The chiefs of Edom, south by southeast, will be terrified. Trembling will seize the leaders of Moab, directly east of them. And the inhabitants of Canaan, to make sure we cover the map, will all panic. Terror and dread will fall on all of them. They will be still as a stone because of your powerful arm until your people pass by, Lord, until the people whom you purchased passed by. Now get this. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your possession. Lord, you have prepared the place for your dwelling. Lord, your hands have established the sanctuary. The Lord will reign forever and ever. We need to geek out on verse 17 there. Because when and at what point has God said anything to them, especially to Moses or through Moses, about the concept of a mountain, a sanctuary, any of this stuff? Where does this come from? Inspiration by the Holy Spirit, no doubt. But nonetheless, what does this mean? Because this is definitely casting some lines back to what has already happened in the story, generations, centuries before, that we need to pull forward to get a full understanding and breakdown of what this is. So since your wheels are already nice and greased up, let's keep them turning. He says, you will bring them in and plant them. He says in verse 17, Lord, you have prepared the place for your dwelling. And the psalmist says in Psalm 80, you dug up a vine from Egypt, you drove out the nations, you planted it. Considering this concept of hedging out a space for a dwelling, a domicile, a place to live and to do life. And then using this botanical language of vine planting. Where in the story up until this point have we seen any sort of intentional act that would cover anything like that? Garden, Eden, somebody over here I think was going to say creation. Absolutely, that's spot on. As we find out in chapter 2 of Genesis, the Lord God planted a garden in Eden, but we know that this is sacred space. It's the first prototypical temple then. And if we're thinking that, when we read on in verse 17 and him talking about establishing a sanctuary, man, we're already getting these neural bridges connected to each other. In verse 9 of Genesis 2, the Lord God caused to grow out of the ground every tree that he had formed. And remember from chapter 1, he said that trees specifically have seed within them to produce more of their own kind. We pass over that like, yeah, I learned that in 5th grade biology. Big deal. You plant a banana seed, if you could get one out, and there you'll have a banana tree. Same with an orange, same with the lemon. Seeds make more of whatever. But it's the idea of this is the fact that's the only thing that God references through Moses as being in the garden. There had to be so much more. But why bring a reference and attention to trees? Because of that. Because man is planted like a tree in the garden. And in the Hebrew mindset, there is nothing that really differentiates between a big tall tree, a little miniature tree that we would call a bush, or a vine. It's all woody. It all does the same thing. And they all bear either fruit or flowers. So, moving on. On the mountain of your possession, Lord, your hands have established the sanctuary. Consider what Ezekiel said in Ezekiel 28, that Eden, the garden of God, was on the holy mountain of God. So this would cause us then to have to go all the way back over here to Genesis chapter 1 to remember that Eden, at least metaphorically, doesn't seem to be on a flat plain, but rather on a mountain, either on the side of it or on the top of it, one or the other. But consider also that in Deuteronomy, later Moses is going to give this final bit of instruction to these people and say, when you finally go in to possess this land, God will intentionally choose a place to centralize your gathering. That you're not to just gather wherever you want. He will choose a place for his name, as if it's a separate, distinctive thing from him, but yet somehow still part of him. For his name to dwell there. And there is where you will go. There is where you will offer up your sacrifices. And of course, Isaiah runs with this like a kid with a kite in Isaiah 27, when he speaks about the messianic time that will come in the future, that there will come a time when all nations will come and worship the Lord at Jerusalem on the holy mountain. So whereas with Moses, there's no concept as to where that will be, for Isaiah, they've been living that reality now for almost 300 years at this point. So again, what can we say with respect to this particular portion of Moses' song that might allude back to creation? Can anybody help to connect the dots here? What is he saying with respect to what God is intending for their design as a nation? What is he broadcasting is going to be God's purpose for them when they go into the land of Canaan? If we go back and speak of this in terms of the creation story. That he wants to dwell with them. Oh man, spot on. That's exactly right. God wants to dwell amongst his people. He wants them to make a mishkan, a tabernacle, a place for him and them to dwell and do business together. But there's an agenda behind the garden too. It's not just, hey, everybody gets to be here and live happy sappy. Instead, it's I have something for you to do, and I want you to cultivate this space. I want you to rule and subdue. I want you to guard, watch, keep, all that stuff, correct? And with that in mind, that speaks to what God tells them in verse 15 of chapter 2 of Genesis, that the Lord God took the man, placed him in the Garden of Eden to do those very things. Avad, shamar, those Hebrew terms that come right from the priestly passages of Numbers. All right, lastly. So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him I'll get ahead of myself here. So as we move on beyond this song, then they finally make it to the waters of Marah. And with this, we have a little bit of a problem. Somebody apparently tries to sample the water, and they realize real quick, this is not suitable for us to drink. I have no idea why. That is completely irrelevant. I made the statement last week that I probably should qualify now by using it again. Those are one of the stupid facts of the Bible. By stupid fact, I don't mean it's dumb to try to chase it down. All I mean is that if we can chase it down and we isolate an answer as to why were the waters undrinkable, what does it do for the larger context of the Bible? If it doesn't illuminate our understanding of anything else in the Bible, it's one of those stupid facts, like what is pi to the 17th decimal place after the decimal? It's great if you can recite that. Why does it matter? Does anybody actually use that in a paper calculation these days? I mean, hopefully you kind of get what I'm saying by that. It's one of those things, it's great to find out, great to memorize, but if it doesn't advance our understanding of the narrative overall and help us connect the points that God, as the ultimate author of Scripture, working through human agents, that is crafting and designing for us to get, that just really needs to kind of stay on the shelf. It's wasted neural space when we could be getting to these deeper things. Either way, so then when this happens and it's brought to Moses' attention, he cries out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he threw it into the water became drinkable. What's so great about the tree? Does it matter? Are there magical properties of the tree? Was it a tree or was it a bush? Was it a dead tree limb? Was it a live tree? Did they have to actually cut the thing down? None of this matters. But what does matter is what happens after this, because it seems to get a little weird. I mean, it all happens almost in the blink of an eye. Water's not drinkable. Moses cries out to the Lord. God somehow draws attention to a tree, a shrub, or something, and tells him to pick it up. He picks it up, he puts it in the waters are changed. And then God begins to speak after that, and he tells Moses that this has now become a statute, an ordinance. If you're looking with me in Exodus 15, it's verses 25 and 26. A statute and an ordinance for them at Marah, and he tested them there. Now, testing, in the concept of biblical speak, is all about trial. In other words, it's to reveal the character of the person who is being put into the heat of the trial. That's why it becomes such a problem if you attempt to try to put God under trial. Why testing the Lord is a sinful thing, because that's to try to reveal the character of God, as if you were calling that into question almost in a legal sense, as if you were putting him under scrutiny on the witness stand. That's blasphemous. But it's intentional for us because we are the weak, frail, faulty creatures who are responsible for our sinfulness and need to learn more about ourselves that God already sees and knows. But nonetheless, God puts them through trial there, and he says this: if you will carefully obey the Lord your God, and on and on and on. What does this have to do with making the waters drinkable? Doesn't that seem weird and kind of disconnected? Like, why does he tell them after he's made the water drinkable that if you will obey all, what has he told them as those commands at this point? Has he given them any precepts to follow other than the Torah explicitly and exclusively related to Passover and consecration of firstborn animals and human beings? Has he given them any other commands, really, as a nation? No. So why is he bringing this about? Well, look what happens in the story immediately after this in verse 27. Then they come to Elim. So God, being the one leading them by cloud, brings them to this place known as Elim. And let's notice Moses' description of it geographically, where there were 12 springs and 70 date palms, and they camped there by water. Now imagine, you're in a complete wide open desert. There's nothing around that you would remotely call hospitable, and certainly not for a group numbering probably well over 1 million. And you've walked into a place where there are 12 flowing springs and 70 date palms. If you had to give that a name, what would you call that? Eden, oasis, paradise, all of them under the same umbrella. That's exactly right. That God here has tested them. He's told them, if you will basically listen to my Torah and walk in it, this is what you get. I will bring you to Elim, Eden, where there is water, where there are fruit trees, to feed you. If that doesn't take you back to Eden, dude, I don't know what does. Right there. The river went out from Eden, and then the Lord God told him, you are free to eat from any of the trees in the garden. Now, just as a direct allusion to the New Testament, if we're ever asking ourselves the question of, okay, that's great, that's wonderful to know, why does this matter? Because when you get to a place like this in the Bible, hopefully these things start to make a little bit more sense. Because Jesus' resurrection language in all of the Gospels is directly tied to this. Think about it. Matthew 28, verse 1. And of course, there are going to be some things here I'll say that we have already alluded to, but I'm trying to put all of it together for you. That Matthew says in his resurrection passage that on the first day of the week, as the day was dawning, notice this, first day. Here we have, I'm trying to see where my little mouse is. There we go. In the 601st year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, straight from the flood passage. If that is a new creation passage in which God has destroyed the earth, he's bringing about anew to give it to a new king priest, and on, why the specificity of the days? Then when we get to another place like Exodus chapter 12, where he basically says the same thing through Moses, where he says, this month is to be the beginning of months for you. On the first, it is the first month of your year. Granted, first day is not mentioned there, but it's still the same concept. First year, first month, first day from Noah's story. New beginnings. And of course, as we just got done talking about, that's what the Exodus story is all about. And the idea of this being the first day, at the time of the day it's actually happening, when light was beginning to come about, would take us all the way back to the first passage you mentioned for us, where light is given in Genesis chapter 1. Let there be light, and there was light. We go to Mark's gospel. They went to the tomb at sunrise. Same thing with respect to Genesis chapter 1. But notice that John gives us a little bit more detail. That they came to the tomb so early that it was still kind of dark, so we haven't even broached into the first few hours or moments of daylight. Consider more of the creation language in Genesis chapter 1, where on day 4 we have a dichotomy created between the light that God had originally made, and now he fills that space with these heavenly luminaries, especially the two great lights, the one that rules over the day, and of course the one that rules over the night. And notice, he says the purpose of these things is not only to mark seasons, days, and years and so forth, but to separate light from darkness. Inconsequential to us in Genesis 1, but what's going on in the moment of Jesus' resurrection? Every morning when the sun comes up, the darkest hour that has happened over the last 12 occurs the very moment before dawn happens. And as those rays begin to peek up over the eastern horizon, every place the light touches, what happens to the darkness? It goes away, as if creation in the mind of the ancients is literally reborn every day with the fire washing of the earth as the sun comes up and chases the darkness and the chaos back into the shadows where it belongs. Why in the world does Jesus need to rise at the moment of the sun coming up in the morning? Couldn't he have done it in the middle of the night? Couldn't he have done it at high noon? Of course he could. That's why. The biblical pattern that's already set for us. And better yet, consider Matthew going back into detail with respect to the idea of an earthquake, right? And we go back to the creation story of Genesis 7, when God is tearing creation apart and the great fountains of the deep burst open. You can imagine an earthquake was responsible for that. But consider this, even though we don't have it given for us in the Exodus account, the psalmist, reflecting on it later on in Psalm 77, says, the earth shook and quaked. Your way went through the sea, your path through the vast water, but your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Why does Matthew tell us there's an earthquake? Oh, because an angel came down from heaven, and his presence was so powerful that the earth could not take him, landing there on the tomb, that it just had to start quaking and shivering back and forth. Why don't the other three gospel writers write about that? Why is Matthew the one who alludes to so much more of the story of the Old Testament from beginning to end than any of the other gospel writers give us this detail? That's why. Because this is a moment of new creation with Jesus' resurrection. All right. So any questions on any of that? All right. Let's move on. So this is what I hope that we're starting to kind of catch in working through passages like this. What I'm helping you build in your mind is an understanding of what I've come to call pattern, implications, and then application. So I've tried to really break this down and make it easier for both you and me by color coding it. So in orange, pattern; blue, implications; in anticipation, purple. And there can be some bleeding over here of what you see, but nonetheless, with creation, you see it there. I don't have to read block for block, but the implication is perhaps capitalized the most with respect to that bottom block. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, piggybacking on the language of rule and subdue. So this begins the precedent of the pattern. We've already talked about how the flood story is a recapitulation of this. Same thing, all right, with God establishing a new image bearer and a king priest in Noah. He wants to reestablish this kingdom principle because he has subdued everything underneath Noah and him as the authority over it all. The idea is to bring Eden blessing to the nations. We capture that even better or more prolifically with respect to looking at the geographical patterns and breakdown of what Moses has to say about the Garden of Eden and the river that came through it and then broke off once it leaves the garden into 4 rivers. And the places that these rivers flow toward, whether it's Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, Jerusalem, the idea is that Eden blessing is supposed to flow to the nations, not stay pent up in the garden, but move beyond that. And then if we're thinking that, well, there is something of a pattern there, then what does that say if we have isolated the Exodus story and them leaving Egypt as yet another creation story, and God bringing about new creation for this people he has made from Abraham as his covenant family that's supposed to somehow bless all the nations? Now it's kind of transformed, or at least expanded, to the idea of there being image bearers, a kingdom of priests. His kingdom concept and principle hasn't changed. He intends to bring Eden presence and blessing to the nations, symbolically through this tabernacle that will eventually become a temple, but even broaden out the nation itself so that everybody gets the chance to become a part of it. That's what he promised Abraham, that all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you, and every generation of Abraham's descendants after that takes that promise on themselves to bring it forward. All right, so now let's kind of work through this a little bit and play with it some. Let's go to Exodus 16, and we will read the first 19 verses. The entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had left the land of Egypt. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us up to this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. The people are going to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way I will test them, put them through trial to see whether or not they will follow my instructions." Because God needs to know that, right? He needs to know whether or not they're going to. Because at this point, he's entirely clueless. It's 50-50. Either they will or they won't. And he needs to discover that answer for himself so he'll know how to correct the course if they don't. Or is it that God is meaning to reveal something within them as a lesson for them to learn and understand about who they are and even who he is? Verse 5, on the 6th day, when you prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other day. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "This evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see that the Lord's glory, because he has heard your complaints about him. For who are we that you will complain to us?" Moses continued, "The Lord will give you meat to eat this evening and all the bread that you want in the morning, for he has heard the complaints that you are raising against him." Who are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your complaints. As Aaron was speaking to the entire Israelite community, they turned toward the wilderness, and there in a cloud the Lord's glory appeared. The Lord spoke to Moses, I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will eat bread until you're full. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. So at evening quail came and covered the camp. In the morning there was a layer of dew all around the camp. When the layer of dew evaporated, there were fine flakes on the desert surface, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they asked one another, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. Moses told them, it is the bread the Lord your God has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each person needs to eat. You may take 2 quarts per individual according to the number of people each of you has in his tent. So the Israelites did this. Some gathered a little, and some gathered a lot. When they measured it by quarts, the person who gathered a lot had no surplus. The person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat. Moses said to them, no one is to let any of it remain until morning. No one, in instruction, Torah, no one is to let any of it remain until morning. All right, so let's explore this concept, pattern, creation. God creates the human, Adam. He puts the man in the sacred space. God gives the man wisdom through Torah. You're free to eat from any tree. Do not eat from that tree. What does the human do? He eats from the forbidden fruit, right? Okay, so we move over to the next creation story in the flood. God delivers Noah from the exile of the flood as he has exiled the rest of humanity and all creation to the oblivion of the flood itself. God grants him headship over creation in Genesis 8 and 9 when he brings him out of the ark on that mountaintop and he puts it all before him and tells him what exactly he intends to do. If we're moving on with the pattern, what do you think God is going to give him next? God gives him Torah in this new world. What he can do, can't do. Right? What happens when you kill an animal? How you treat the animal. You don't eat its blood. That what will happen if an animal kills a man or a man kills a man. Torah instruction. With respect to that, what do you think then is going to come next in the pattern? Noah opts to get drunk from wine, which he knew would happen. There's no doubt about that fact. Let's go to another potential creation story with respect to Abraham and what's going on with him. Considering the events of the Tower of Babel, and that's another exile, God delivers Abraham from exile. That happens at Babel. He brings Abraham to new sacred space. What do you think God's going to do next? He's going to guide him with Torah, where to go, what to do. Walk all throughout this land. Every place your foot touches, I'm going to give you. You're going to bless all the nations of the earth. As soon as he gets to the land, what do you think is going to come next in this pattern? He opts for Egypt during the famine. What happens there? Calamity. Now we have this particular moment. Israel as a nation, God has just delivered them from exile in Egypt. He's bringing them to himself at Sinai, where heaven and earth are going to touch each other again, just like they did in Genesis 1 through 3. What do you think God is about to give them? What do you think he just gave them? He's not rolled out the whole thing with the Decalogue and the 10 Commandments, but he just told them what to do and not to do, as goes, I'm giving you food, here's how you collect it, and here's what you do and don't do with it. So, one simple task like don't eat from that tree, don't gather too much, don't let it hold over until the morning. You do this 6 days a week, but for the Sabbath, you already gathered what you need the day before. But what do you think they're going to do? So yeah, after the first day, Moses has to contend with some people who open up some jars and they're heartbroken because what they stored there the day before is now turned into maggots and worms and stinks. A sign of death, judgment that comes from being dumb and not listening to God. And then what happens when the morning of the Sabbath rolls out and Moses is pulling back his tent flap and his eyes get pierced by the blindingness of the sun coming through and he rubs that sleep out of his eyes and he's like, am I seeing people out there actually walking around? What are you looking for? Hey, you, what are you doing? Where's the manna? All right, come here. We need to have a little chat. They don't listen. They don't listen. And this sets us up for what's going to come later. Let's go to chapter 17 and read the first 7 verses. Verse 5. The Lord answered to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take the staff you struck the Nile with in your hand and go. I'm going to stand there in front of you on the rock of Horeb. When you hit the rock, water will come out of it and the people will drink." Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. He named the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites complained and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord amongst us or not?" So again, pattern, implications, application. They have the instance of the waters of Meribah. The people complained about the water. God promised Eden-like abundance if they will walk in His commands, His Torah. Okay? I have tested you. You've seen the problem here. The problem is not me. The problem is you. You complained, but I answered with that. This was an insurmountable obstacle for you that you were helpless to do anything about, and I solved it before you could blink your eyes. And then He shows them. He doesn't leave it open for speculation. He leads them right up to a paradise in Elim to give them full understanding of this is the fruit of your reward if you will simply follow me. So now moving beyond that, here they have the food in the wilderness of sin, what we just talked about with respect to manna. They complain about food, God blesses with manna, but ultimately they prove that they were incapable of trusting Him, or at least they failed to in that particular moment. Now here they are at the water of Rephidim. They complain once again about lack of water rather than relying on God. They have the instance of Meribah to refer back to, but they ultimately fail to trust God. And they full on proclaim that by anticipating death, not life, death. You brought us here to die, not God to bring us here to live, in spite of every indicator around us showing us that if left to our own concoctions, we would die. What does this set us up for with respect to entering the land? Because we know that's on the horizon. Again, pretend like we are first-time Bible readers, have no idea how this story goes. We just know it's been broadcasted, that's where they're going, and we are waiting on bated breath. What happens when they get there? They are learning to trust God, and what happens when they fail to, but God has not really let His feathers get ruffled at this point, and He's not done anything judgmental towards them in a harsh or abrasive way. But what will happen when they go to the land? Considering the pattern, what do you think will happen? And considering the implications of the meager amount of judgment, consider the worms and the stench in that pot of manna that was reserved to the following morning, or the brokenheartedness for those people who we can assume didn't save enough provisions on that Friday morning for the following Sabbath day and maybe went to bed that night with hungry bellies. What do you think that they would hopefully learn? And what do you think ultimately this pattern is going to reveal itself to be? All right, so far, any questions? All right, let's keep going with chapter 17. We're only going through 19, so we're almost there. Verses 8 through 16. This is a bit of a weird story. At Rephidim, Amalek came out and fought against Israel. Moses said to Joshua, "Select some men for us and go fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the hilltop with God's staff in my hand." Joshua did as Moses had told him and fought against Amalek. While Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill, and while Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But when he put his hand down, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew heavy, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat down on it. Then Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on each side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until the sun went down. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his army with the sword. The Lord then said to Moses, "Write this down on a scroll as a reminder and recite it to Joshua. I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven." And Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, "Indeed, my hand is lifted up toward the Lord's throne. The Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation." Again, it's all about patterns. Think about this. Humans are created, placed in the garden. They are tested regarding the Torah that God has given. The Shining One seeks to prevent them from trusting in the Lord. Now, the people, almost in similar fashion, because they're, as Adam was created outside the garden and intentionally put in it, the people have left death in Egypt to go to the place of life in the provincial Eden that God is preparing them to go into. He's marching them in that direction. They are traveling to Sinai to meet the Lord, like the man put in the garden was meeting with the Lord. Now, their hearts are being deliberately tested by the Lord. They already have with respect to the waters at Marah and the food at the wilderness of sin and the waters of Rephidim. And here they are still at Rephidim. And God is going to allow them to be tested again through Amalek attacking. Remember, the trials were to reveal the character of their hearts. Amalek attacks. Now, it's kind of funny that just some chapters ago, as they are about to leave Egypt, they haven't even left yet. In Exodus 13, God said, the people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war. That's why he did not take them on the northern road to walk right through the land of Philistia to go into the land of Canaan, and instead brought them to Sinai, if anybody was wondering. So why in the world then, this soon after they leave Egypt, does he allow them to run head on into Amalek? Why does he allow Amalek to attack? Better yet, after Amalek attacks and they have prepared a counter assault against them, is the whole thing going with Moses' hands being down, then Amalek prevails, so the arms have to be kept up in order for God's people to prevail. Who's the one that's really driving the show here? Is it Moses or is it God? What is going on here? Well, maybe, just maybe, this might be a moment in which the enemy, Shining One, might have seen the advantage of what would occur if he attacks them now. After all, if the Lord thinks they're fragile enough that if they face open warfare against an organized army with chariots like the Philistines, though the Amalekites are not quite as armed or organized, they'll lose heart and want to run back to Egypt. After this story, we're going to see plenty of moments where these people are ready to give up and go back to Egypt. They are pining away for that place, and when they finally do get up to the brink of the land, they want to kill Moses, elect a new leader, and go back to the land. So why don't they do that now? Perfect opportunity for the enemy to use an outward existential threat against them to cause them all now to throw everything down and run wholesale back to Egypt. But remember, and this I think perhaps provides something of the explainer as to why God tells Moses to write this on a scroll and recite it to Joshua. Who's Joshua going to be in the story moving forward? Rhetorical question. But better yet, why does it need to be told him that the Lord is going to be at constant perpetual war with Amalek from generation to generation? Better yet, considering that everybody in here, I'm sure, is familiar enough with the story moving forward to know that the next big conflagration with Amalek doesn't come until the people have a king, Saul, and then David after him. Where in the 400 years that intervene between all that is there intergenerational war with Amalek? It seems like this almost goes unfulfilled. What does this mean? If the enemy is the one provoking, tempting, alluring them to try to turn back and defy God and go back to Egypt, then it would seem like there's some crafty snake work at play here. But the Lord allows them to prevail. And whereas we don't have this in Genesis 3 with the man, the first image bearer, being victorious, prevailing over the snake, here we get a glimpse of what that looks like. We have a group of nomadic marauders who love to hide themselves in the rocky crags of the paths and whatnot that people will follow and travel through as they go down. This is why everybody travels caravan style here, and they do so with swords and whatever weapons they can travel with, because they know these people have a historical predilection for preying on people traveling like this. They're good at it, really good at it. You would think that they would be the ones better suited for victory here, and yet the Lord delivers them into the hands of the Israelites, who at this point we have no mention of any weapons in their hands. I'm not saying they fought with rocks, but I don't know what they fought with other than their bare hands. And yet God allows them to prevail. They've never once been tested in battle. Not a one of these men were warriors, and yet they win. All right. Here in Genesis 18, we've got a story here of another Gentile priest doing the right thing, which I think is a little strange. I'm going to read a few of these verses. I don't have time to read them all, but if you'll follow with me in Genesis 18, starting in verse 1. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, heard about everything that God had done for Moses and for God's people Israel when the Lord brought them out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, along with her two sons, one of whom was named Gershom, the other one Eleazar. And in verse 5, Moses' father-in-law Jethro, along with Moses' wife and sons, came to him in the wilderness where he was camped at the mountain of God. Just as a side note, sometimes we don't pay attention to these little details. Exodus 19 is where we actually have them arriving at the mountain of God, Sinai. But Jethro arrives when they are there. So what are we to make of this? perhaps not everything that's given to us in the way that we normally appreciate chronological sequencing in modern literature is written that way in the Bible. In other words, some of us, I think, are pretty keen to the idea when you are reading 4 gospel accounts of Jesus that not all of those writers are paying the same level of attention to detail as goes what happens next in the sequence. Why does this author put this there and this one puts that there and something that separates them out? Who has the right historical sequence? Who knows and who cares? To them, that didn't matter any more than it mattered here. Why in the world do we have in Genesis 18 this mention of Jethro coming to them when they're already at Sinai, but they don't get to Sinai until Exodus 19 because it matters as goes the sequence of the story in a theological sense. And hopefully this makes a better representation of that. Anyway, let me go on. Verse 6, he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, am coming to you with your wife and your 2 sons. So Moses went down to meet his father-in-law, bowed down, then kissed him. And then they asked each other how they had been, and they went into each other to the tent. Moses recounted to his father-in-law all the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that confronted them on the way and how the Lord rescued them. Jethro rejoiced over all the good things the Lord had done for Israel when he rescued them from the power of the Egyptians. Blessed be the Lord, Jethro exclaimed, who rescued you from the power of Egypt and from the power of Pharaoh. He has rescued you, or rescued the people from under the power of Egypt. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods because he did wonders when the Egyptians acted arrogantly against Israel. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in God's presence. Why does this matter? This is why. Go back to the story that we have in the early portions of Genesis. Follow the sequence. Abraham leaves Egypt, and before God covenants with him, yes, Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3 could be the beginnings of covenant, but as far as God actually entering into a dual expression and understanding of what this means, those terms do not necessarily come until right there in Genesis 15, all right? But before that, in Genesis 14, we've got a battle. So before God covenants with Abraham in the place he wants him, that's Canaan, there's a battle. The armies of the east and west. Remember Kedorlaomer and the battle between him and the... Okay. Abram's victorious over the coalition of the east. He rescues Lot. And then after that, as they're coming back to restore everybody to where they belong and give them their stuff, Melchizedek comes from the mountain city Jerusalem to bless Abram. And while he does that, Melchizedek blesses God, and a feast ensues. And he utters the words, Blessed be God Most High, the God of Abram. Follow the sequence here. Before God covenants with them at Sinai, there's a battle. They haven't been brought to Sinai yet, according to this. And before that happens, they face Amalek there out in the open. Moses and Israel are victorious over Amalek. Then Jethro comes to the mountain of God to bless the God of Israel. When he blesses the God of Israel, a feast ensues. It's bread and wine in Melchizedek's case. Now it's meat, bread and wine, with burnt offerings and sacrifices. And he utters the words, Blessed be the Lord. And again, if we can consider the implications of what happened in the Melchizedek story and the idea that those who bless Abraham and his family are blessed by the Lord, so can be said for Jethro. We might not have a story of how that will necessarily happen, so to speak, but what we do also understand is that the priesthood that was given to man in Adam, in the Garden of Eden, transcends and has greater concepts and implications and themes with respect to the impact that God wants it to over the Levitical priesthood. And somehow Israel winds up losing concept of that, and the priesthood itself becomes the whole reason, the heart and soul of the nation's existence, at the expense of the idea that God seeks to ultimately reconcile the nations and bring them to be a part of their covenant people. I will have to skip over this. I don't have time to cover that. Instead, I would like to cover this last slide, or concept of slides here. Exodus 19, in these last few minutes that we got. All right, if you'll read a few verses with me. In the 3rd month, from the very day the Israelites left the land of Egypt, they came to the Sinai wilderness. They traveled from Rephidim, came to the Sinai wilderness, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Moses went up the mountain to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. This is what you must say to the house of Jacob, and explain to the Israelites, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, You will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites. Verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear when I speak with you and will always believe you. Moses reported the words to the Lord. And the Lord said told Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. They must wash their clothes. Be prepared by the third day, for on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put boundaries for the people all around the mountain and say, be careful that you do not go up on the mountain or touch its base. Anyone who touches the mountain must be put to death. Verse 16. On the third day, when morning came, there was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud blast from a ram's horn, so that all the people in the camp shuddered. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was completely enveloped in smoke because the Lord came down on it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. As the sound of the ram's horn grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. Ideal setting. First few chapters of Genesis with a sneak peek over there in Ezekiel 28, and you know the reason for that allusion. Here's the ideal setting. You've got God. You've got members of the divine council. Don't forget about the cherubim. And it's also the mention in Ezekiel 28 about the guardian cherub who seemingly pushed the Adam king-like priest out of the garden. We've got an image bearer present, which is Adam, and all of creation before him. That's the ideal setting of God, as Warren said, dwells with man. Then, big red line, fall happens. Now we have to view this from an altered angle. The next place we run into this is right here in Exodus 19. Let's see if we've got all the elements. God's presence, the divine council is present, reference later on your old time in Deuteronomy 33, but the verses are there about God bringing from Sinai, Seir, wilderness of Paran, all together in this place, his holy ones, his 10,000s and thousands of holy ones. That's his divine council. His image bearers are present, this whole kingdom of priests, and all of creation too, at least in a somewhat abbreviated sense, considering the idea that they have their flocks and their herds. But this priestly representation of all of creation is what's taken into consideration. Now, this is why this matters. The point of this, holding that altered angle in view, when we get to places like this in Ezekiel 1, it should not become surprising to us then when we see all of these elements called right back up to the foreground and become the center point of view for us. Because as Ezekiel is beholding this vision, here we have God's presence. The divine council is also present, but moving on with the theme of God's presence, he tells us on the throne, high above, was someone who looked like a human. Remember, it's this big moving glass plane, and we've got these four living creatures underneath it that have four faces, and they have multiple pairs of wings with hands, and there are these wheels inside of wheels, and there's fire, and there's lightning, and this thing is seemingly moving, defying every possible way the laws of physics. And on top of that is this figure seated on a throne-like structure with a bow around him like a rainbow, and again, fire from virtually the waist up. And then, divine council, the living creatures I had seen beneath the God of Israel. I recognize them, that they are indeed cherubim. God's image bearer is present because in chapter 2 of Ezekiel, he speaks to him saying, Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. And all of creation before him. If you've ever wondered why in the world the cherubim have these faces of man, lion, ox, eagle, it's all to represent what God implanted on this earth to bring reminders of heaven to this space that man shares with God in. That's really the best explanation that scholarly theology can pour out to us, is that it's meant to constantly remind us that though something of a veil has been established between these spheres of reality in the moments of the fall, yet we have constant perpetual reminder of the fact that once it was all together. I'm not saying we were in heaven. I'm saying both God's space and man's space were once one. Consider also the other language here. The Lord came from Sinai, appeared to them with lightning from his right hand for them. And then Ezekiel makes mention of this too, that fire was moving back and forth between the living creatures. It was bright and lightning came out from it. What does this mean then with respect to the Ezekiel passage? What is Ezekiel being reminded of? These people are in exile. It's not a good time for them. It's a really good time for them in Exodus 19. They get to meet the God who wants to covenant with them. In Ezekiel 1, they have obliterated that covenant in every possible way they could. And yet God in His mercy is still showing up to them in this terrible place of desolation and exile, like Egypt was for them, to show them He's still sovereign, He still cares for them, and He has not forgotten them, and He will bring them back after He is done chastising them for their horrible sins. And then, of course, when you go to a place like Daniel chapter 7, you'll see the same thing. Sorry, there it is. Last slide. So we go through this and I can finally cut you loose. All right. So Daniel chapter 7, again, God's presence, because He says, as He saw in this vision, the Ancient of Days taking His seat amongst the thrones that were set there in place, thousands upon thousands surround Him to serve Him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before Him. His court is convened, thrones all around. This image bearer is pulled directly into His presence, suddenly one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven, and all of creation before Him, because this one who is ascending in the clouds into the presence of the Ancient of Days is given a kingdom whose dominion and glory covers every square inch of the earth, because every person from every nation, tribe, and language belongs to Him. This takes us back not only to Eden, but even to a place like Exodus 19 and what God was doing there. It's important for us to see these things working in the mechanism that they are to help us better understand what's going to come futuristically in the Bible. This is what's going on here in Exodus 19 with God and His people meeting together. And I purposefully left this slide out, but I don't think it goes without saying that certainly you see every one of these pieces and this entire motif fully operational in the closing words of Scripture, in the vision of the apocalypse that John shared with us. That being said, any questions, any comments, any concluding thoughts? No? All right. Well, that is it. Thank you all.